The Alpha King was standing at the altar while half the kingdom silently prayed he would change his mind. The grand cathedral of Silver Moon Palace had never been so crowded. Noble families filled every row beneath the towering stained-glass windows. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished marble floors. Musicians waited beside the altar. Priests stood ready to begin the ceremony. Yet no one seemed focused on the wedding itself. Their attention was fixed on a single woman walking slowly down the center aisle. Charlotte Bennet kept her eyes lowered as hundreds of whispers followed her every step. Her wedding gown was beautiful but simple compared to the elaborate dresses worn by the noble women surrounding her. She was not a duchess. She was not the daughter of an influential alpha family. She was a servant. Just days earlier, she had been carrying trays through palace corridors and helping organize royal chambers. Now she was walking toward the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. The contrast felt impossible. "This is a mistake," one noblewoman whispered. "A servant cannot become queen." Another quietly shook her head. "The king has lost his senses." Charlotte heard enough of the comments to understand exactly what people thought of her. But she kept walking. Years of working inside the palace had taught her how to endure judgment without showing pain. Even now, she carried herself with quiet dignity. At the front of the cathedral stood Alpha King Alexander Blackwood. Tall, composed, unshaken by the storm of criticism surrounding him. His formal black ceremonial coat carried the silver crest of the royal bloodline. Every noble in attendance expected him to look uncertain. Instead, he appeared completely calm. His silver eyes followed Charlotte as she approached. There was no embarrassment in his expression, no hesitation, only quiet certainty. The whispers grew louder. Nobody understood why the king had chosen her. The official explanation had done little to satisfy anyone. Several months earlier, Charlotte had saved a group of palace records from being destroyed during an unexpected accident in one of the archive wings. In the process, she had protected documents that held significant historical value to the kingdom. Alexander had taken notice of her integrity and dedication. Their paths crossed repeatedly afterward. Every conversation revealed another layer of kindness, another example of humility, another reason to respect her. Yet to everyone watching today, that explanation seemed absurd. Respecting a servant was one thing. Marrying her was another. Charlotte finally reached the altar. The enormous cathedral became strangely quiet. Alexander offered his hand. She hesitated for the briefest moment before placing her hand in his. Warmth spread through her chest. For the first time all morning, she felt less alone. The ceremony began. Sacred vows echoed beneath the cathedral ceiling. Noble families exchanged skeptical glances. Some looked offended. Others looked fascinated. But Alexander never looked away from Charlotte. As the final blessing was spoken, sunlight streamed through the stained glass and illuminated the altar in silver and gold. The moment should have felt like the end of a journey. Instead, for reasons she could not explain, Charlotte felt as though something had only just begun. Far above the cathedral, hidden within an unused section of the palace archives, an old wooden chest sat untouched beneath decades of dust. No one in the kingdom knew it existed. No one knew that inside rested a sealed letter that had waited more than 20 years to be opened. And written on that forgotten letter was a name that would soon change everything. The morning after the wedding, Charlotte woke before sunrise out of habit. For a few moments, she lay still beneath soft linen blankets, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling above her. The room was larger than the entire servant quarters where she had lived for most of her life. Tall windows overlooked the royal gardens. Silver curtains framed the pale dawn light. Elegant furniture filled every corner. Yet despite the luxury surrounding her, she felt strangely uncomfortable. This room belonged to a queen. Charlotte still felt like a servant. She quietly slipped out of bed and crossed the room. Outside, the palace grounds were beginning to wake. Gardeners prepared flower beds. Guards changed shifts along the outer walls. Birds moved between fountains and marble statues. Everything seemed peaceful, yet Charlotte knew the calm was deceptive. By now, every noble family in the kingdom was discussing the wedding. Every rumor, every criticism, every prediction about how long this unusual marriage would survive. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Charlotte opened it to find 3 palace attendants waiting. Each carried boxes filled with expensive dresses, jewelry, and ceremonial accessories. "Your Majesty," one attendant said with a polite bow. Charlotte still flinched slightly whenever someone used that title. The royal wardrobe has sent your morning selections. Charlotte glanced at the mountain of luxurious fabrics. Thank you. The attendants entered and carefully displayed the items throughout the room. Silks, embroidered gowns, precious stones, the kind of things Charlotte had only seen from a distance. Once they finished, they waited expectantly. Is there something else? Charlotte asked. The youngest attendant hesitated. Which gown would your majesty like for today's luncheon? Charlotte looked around the room. Then she surprised all three women. None of them. They stared at her. Your majesty? Charlotte smiled gently. Please choose whichever one is easiest to maintain. The others should remain protected. The attendants exchanged confused looks. Most nobles demanded more. Charlotte seemed determined to ask for less. Hours later, the palace hosted its first official gathering following the wedding. Dozens of nobles filled a magnificent dining hall decorated with silver flowers and crystal centerpieces. Charlotte entered beside Alexander. Conversations immediately softened. Smiles appeared, yet none of them reached people's eyes. Charlotte recognized the difference. Years of serving meals had taught her how to read a room. The politeness was not acceptance. It was performance. Throughout the meal, subtle comments drifted across the table. Questions disguised as compliments. Curiosity disguised as concern. One duchess smiled sweetly before asking, Your Majesty, are you finding palace life difficult after leaving the servant quarters? Another noblewoman added, The transition must be overwhelming. Charlotte understood exactly what they meant. They were reminding her where she came from. She answered every question with calm courtesy. Never defensive, never angry. Across the table, Alexander noticed everything. The smiles, the hidden insults, the way Charlotte absorbed them without complaint. Yet what caught his attention most was what happened afterward. As guests departed, Charlotte quietly gathered several untouched trays of food. Instead of leaving the task to servants, she carried them herself toward the staff dining area. There she spent nearly 20 minutes speaking with kitchen workers she had known for years, laughing with them, thanking them, treating them exactly as she always had. When Alexander eventually found her, she was helping an elderly cook organize supplies. The woman looked delighted by the assistance. Charlotte did not notice the king watching from the doorway. She simply continued working as though she still belonged among the staff. For the first time since the wedding, Alexander found himself asking a question he could not answer. Why did a woman who had every reason to chase power seem completely uninterested in it? And far above them, hidden inside a forgotten archive tower, workers clearing old storage rooms had just discovered a locked wooden chest covered in decades of dust. 3 days after the wedding, the palace had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Officially, Charlotte was queen. In reality, many people still treated her as though she were only temporarily occupying the role. Invitations arrived addressed to the king alone. Noble women organized private gatherings without including her. Conversations often stopped when she entered a room. Charlotte noticed everything, but she never complained. Instead, she focused on the things she could control. On a bright afternoon, she crossed the eastern courtyard carrying a small basket of documents requested by the palace library. The spring air was cool, and sunlight reflected from the white stone pathways. Several servants hurried past, preparing for an upcoming council meeting. Charlotte greeted each of them by name. Most smiled in surprise. Very few royals bothered to remember servants' names. As she approached one of the side corridors, raised voices caught her attention. She slowed her pace. 2 senior attendants stood near a storage room, speaking sharply to a young maid. The girl looked no older than 17. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched a folded inventory sheet against her chest. The missing silverware was under your supervision, one attendant said coldly. Someone must be held responsible. But I checked the records twice, the maid insisted. I did not lose anything. The second attendant crossed her arms. The count is wrong. The responsibility is yours. Charlotte watched for a moment before stepping forward. What happened? The attendants immediately straightened. Your Majesty. Charlotte looked toward the frightened maid. Tell me. The girl hesitated before explaining. An inventory count had revealed several missing ceremonial pieces. Because she had signed the records, she was being blamed for the mistake. Charlotte listened carefully. Then she asked to see the paperwork. The attendants exchanged uncertain glances but handed it over. Charlotte reviewed the documents in silence. Years of working throughout the palace had taught her how supplies moved between departments. Within minutes, she noticed something unusual. A transfer request had been filed 2 days earlier. The silverware had been relocated for restoration. The inventory had never actually been missing. The update simply had not been recorded in the correct ledger. Charlotte handed the documents back. She did nothing wrong. The attendants looked surprised. The young maid stared in disbelief. Charlotte pointed to the transfer authorization. The items were moved here. One attendant quickly reviewed the page and realized Charlotte was correct. Embarrassment immediately replaced confidence. I see. The maid's shoulders visibly relaxed. Thank you, Your Majesty. Charlotte smiled gently. Always verify before assuming the worst. She then continued toward the library as though nothing extraordinary had happened. What she did not realize was that someone had witnessed the entire exchange. From an upper balcony overlooking the courtyard, Alexander stood beside a council advisor. He had been on his way to a meeting when the scene below caught his attention. Most nobles preferred authority. Charlotte preferred fairness. Most people protected their reputation. Charlotte protected someone with no power at all. The difference stayed with him. As Charlotte disappeared into the corridor, Alexander found himself watching longer than necessary. There was something about her that refused to fit the image others tried to create. And later that evening, deep inside the archive tower, workers finally succeeded in opening the dust-covered wooden chest. Hidden beneath layers of forgotten documents rested a sealed envelope bearing an ancient crest that nobody had seen in decades. The discovery of the wooden chest should have been an ordinary archival event. Forgotten storage rooms were cleaned every year, and old boxes appeared from time to time. Yet the moment the workers brought the chest to the royal archives, something felt different. The lock was covered in age-darkened metal. Dust clung to every surface. Most unusual of all was the faded crest carved into the lid. Several archivists immediately recognized it, not because they had seen it recently, but because they had only encountered it in history books. By sunrise the following morning, the chest sat inside a secure research room beneath the supervision of the palace's chief historian, Professor Nathaniel Whitmore. The elderly scholar adjusted his spectacles and carefully examined the contents. Most of the documents were routine records from decades earlier. Property transfers, correspondence, family registries. Nothing remarkable. Then he discovered the sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but the wax seal remained intact. The same forgotten crest appeared on its surface. Whitmore frowned. He had spent 40 years studying royal history, yet even he rarely encountered symbols this old. Slowly, he broke the seal. The room fell silent. Other archivists gathered nearby as he unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page once, then a second time. By the third reading, all color had disappeared from his face. Professor, one assistant asked nervously. Whitmore looked up. Send a message to the palace immediately. What happened? The old scholar hesitated. This document should not exist. Less than an hour later, Alexander received the request while reviewing council reports. He read the brief message and immediately noticed the unusual wording. Urgent. Historical significance. Private audience requested. The combination was enough to capture his attention. By midday, he arrived at the archives accompanied by only 2 trusted advisors. Whitmore was waiting. The historian bowed respectfully before presenting the letter. Your Majesty, this was found inside the recovered chest. Alexander accepted the document. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. The date caught his attention immediately. 22 years earlier. Several years before he had become king. He continued reading. His expression gradually shifted from curiosity to concentration. Then something else. Surprise. Who else has seen this? Alexander asked quietly. Only a handful of archivists. Whitmore lowered his voice. The contents reference a child hidden from public records. Alexander read the line again. A child protected under special instruction. The wording was vague, yet deliberate. Additional passages hinted at a secret preserved by a small group of trusted individuals. No names appeared initially. Only clues. Fragments. Half-complete references. Yet near the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood out. A record shall remain hidden until the rightful heir reaches adulthood. Alexander stared at the words. Heir. Whitmore nodded. That is what concerns me. The room became very quiet. Alexander folded the letter and looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, The palace could be seen rising above the city skyline. Somewhere inside those walls, Charlotte was likely spending her afternoon exactly as she always did. Speaking with servants, helping staff, avoiding attention whenever possible. The thought arrived unexpectedly. Then another followed. Why had the letter resurfaced now? Meanwhile, Charlotte sat in the palace library organizing returned books alongside several junior attendants. She laughed softly as one young servant struggled to balance an oversized stack of volumes. For a brief moment, she looked completely at peace, unaware that only a few hundred yards away, her name had just appeared for the first time inside a document hidden for more than 2 decades. And before sunset arrived, Alexander would discover something that made the mystery far more personal than anyone expected. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed in ways most people could not yet explain. Rumors moved through corridors faster than official announcements. Archivists whispered to advisors. Advisors whispered to council members. Small fragments of information drifted from room to room without revealing the full truth. Charlotte noticed the tension immediately. Servants who normally greeted one another casually now exchanged nervous glances. Several senior officials appeared distracted during meetings. Even the palace guard seemed unusually alert. Yet nobody told her why. She spent most of the afternoon helping reorganize materials in the library. It was one of the few places where she still felt comfortable. Books had not changed simply because she had become queen. Shelves remained shelves. Records remained records. The quiet familiarity eased her mind. As sunset approached, a messenger arrived carrying a sealed request. His Majesty would like to see you in the West Garden. Charlotte looked surprised. Alexander rarely interrupted her responsibilities unless something important required discussion. She thanked the messenger and made her way through the palace. The West Garden was nearly empty when she arrived. Golden evening light filtered through flowering trees. A fountain murmured softly nearby. Alexander stood beside a stone pathway overlooking the grounds below. For a moment neither spoke. The setting sun painted long shadows across the garden. "You asked to see me?" Charlotte finally said. Alexander turned toward her. His expression was thoughtful, more serious than usual. "I have a question." "Of course." He studied her carefully. "What do you know about your family?" The question caught her completely off guard. Charlotte blinked. "My family?" "Yes." She looked away briefly. "Not much." Alexander remained silent, allowing her to continue. "My parents died when I was very young. I was raised by my grandmother until she passed away. After that, I worked wherever I could." A faint sadness touched her voice. There was never much information beyond that. Alexander nodded slowly. "Did your grandmother ever speak about relatives?" Charlotte thought for a moment. Sometimes she would start to tell stories, then stop. Stop. As though she had changed her mind. The king exchanged a glance with the fountain water shimmering behind her. Something in that answer seemed important. "Do you still have any belongings that came from your family?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "Only a few things. Such as an old necklace, a wooden jewelry box, letters with no signatures." She laughed softly. "Nothing valuable." Alexander's attention sharpened immediately. "A necklace?" Charlotte nodded. "I have worn it since I was a child." For the first time, Alexander noticed the delicate silver chain resting beneath the collar of her dress. It was simple, elegant, unremarkable at first glance. Yet something about it felt strangely familiar. Before he could ask another question, hurried footsteps approached across the garden path. Professor Nathaniel Whitmore appeared carrying several documents pressed tightly against his chest. The elderly historian rarely moved quickly. Tonight, he looked almost breathless. "Your Majesty," he said. "I apologize for the interruption." Alexander immediately recognized the urgency in his voice. "What happened?" Whitmore glanced toward Charlotte before lowering his voice. "The second letter has been translated." Silence settled over the garden. The professor swallowed carefully. "And this time, there is a name." Charlotte felt an unexpected chill. Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Whose name?" Whitmore looked directly at Charlotte. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "Charlotte Bennett." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the garden, carrying the scent of flowers across the stone pathways. Charlotte stared at Professor Whitmore, certain she had misunderstood what he had just said. Her name. The translated letter contained her name. It made no sense. "There must be a mistake," she whispered. Whitmore shook his head slowly. I thought so as well. He carefully opened the folder in his hands and removed several pages. The translation was reviewed 3 separate times by different historians. Alexander stepped closer. Show me. The professor handed him the documents. Charlotte watched as Alexander's eyes moved across the pages. His expression remained calm, but she noticed the subtle tension forming in his jaw. Whatever he was reading was important. Very important. What does it say? Charlotte finally asked. Whitmore took a slow breath. The letter refers to a child whose identity was deliberately concealed. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Why? That part remains unclear. The historian lowered his voice. However, the document repeatedly mentions protection, secrecy, and a future inheritance connected to an ancient family line. The words sounded distant. Unreal. Charlotte looked between the two men. And my name is connected to this? Yes. The answer came immediately. Silence followed. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm beside them. Somewhere in the distance, palace bells announced the evening hour. Yet the garden suddenly felt isolated from the rest of the world. Alexander folded the papers carefully. Who else knows? Only a handful of archivists and myself. Whitmore hesitated. For now. The king nodded. Keep it that way. The professor bowed his head. Of course, Your Majesty. Later that night, Charlotte sat alone in her chambers, unable to sleep. The moonlight spilling through the windows illuminated the silver necklace resting in her hands. She had owned it for as long as she could remember. Her grandmother had given it to her shortly before her death. At the time, she had described it as a family keepsake. Nothing more. Charlotte turned the pendant over. Tiny engraved markings decorated the back. She had never paid much attention to them before. Now she found herself studying every detail. Had there always been a secret hidden inside her ordinary life? Or were people simply seeing meaning where none existed? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Alexander entered a moment later. He looked tired. Not physically, thoughtfully tired. Like someone carrying questions without answers. Charlotte stood immediately. Is there news? He walked toward the window before responding. Only more questions. She managed a faint smile. That seems to be happening often lately. Alexander returned the smile. Then his expression softened. Are you frightened? Charlotte considered the question honestly. A little. Because of the investigation? She looked down at the pendant. Because I do not know who I am supposed to be anymore. The answer lingered between them. Alexander understood. For most of her life, Charlotte had known exactly where she belonged. The certainty had not always been pleasant, but it had been familiar. Now everything was changing. You are still the same person you were yesterday, he said quietly. Charlotte looked up. Am I? Yes. His answer never wavered. Whatever these documents reveal, they do not change your character. The words eased something inside her. Not completely, but enough. After Alexander left, Charlotte stood by the window watching moonlight spread across the palace gardens below. She did not notice the shadowed figure moving through the archive corridors on the far side of the palace. Deep inside the records chamber, another forgotten document had just been discovered. Unlike the letters, this one contained names, dates, family connections, and according to the first lines translated before midnight, someone had spent more than 20 years ensuring that Charlotte Bennet's true identity remained hidden from the kingdom. The following morning began with a summons that reached every major noble house in the kingdom. A special court session had been called inside the Grand Council chamber. No explanation accompanied the announcement. That alone was enough to ignite speculation throughout the capital. By midday, the enormous hall was filled. Dukes, duchesses, advisors, scholars, and senior officials occupied every seat. Conversations drifted through the room in cautious whispers. Some believed the gathering concerned recent archive discoveries. Others suspected political reforms. Very few guessed the truth. Charlotte entered beside Alexander and immediately felt hundreds of eyes settle upon her. The attention was familiar by now, but today felt different. The atmosphere carried anticipation rather than simple judgment. Alexander guided her toward the front of the chamber, where Professor Whitmore waited beside a long table covered with documents. The historian looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, evidence of a night spent reviewing records. Yet despite his fatigue, determination shone in his expression. When the final council members arrived, silence gradually filled the room. Alexander rose first. Thank you for attending. His voice echoed clearly across the chamber. New information has been recovered from the royal archives. Information connected to events that occurred more than 20 years ago. The audience immediately grew attentive. Whitmore stepped forward carrying a collection of translated records. One by one, he presented the evidence. The forgotten letters, the sealed instructions, the hidden family records. Each document strengthened the same conclusion. Murmurs spread through the chamber as nobles exchanged uncertain looks. Charlotte listened carefully, hearing pieces of her own life reflected in records she had never known existed. Then Whitmore revealed the final document discovered during the previous night. The room became completely silent. This registry was hidden within a private archive collection, he explained. Its contents identify a child placed under protected guardianship following the disappearance of an ancient noble line. He unfolded the fragile page. Several council members leaned forward. Whitmore continued. The child was entrusted to a caretaker family under strict secrecy. Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. The historian looked directly at her before speaking again. The records identify that child by name. No one moved. No one breathed. Charlotte Bennett. Shock swept through the chamber. Some nobles stared openly. Others immediately began whispering. A few looked toward Charlotte with disbelief. Whitmore raised a hand for silence. The investigation has verified the authenticity of every recovered document. He paused. Charlotte Bennett is the surviving descendant of House Evermont. The name struck the room like thunder. Even Charlotte recognized it. House Evermont had once been one of the oldest and most respected noble families in the kingdom before mysteriously disappearing from official history. She looked down at the necklace resting against her collar. Suddenly, the stories her grandmother never finished telling seemed far more important. Across the chamber, several nobles appeared stunned. Others looked embarrassed. Many had spent weeks criticizing a woman they believed unworthy of standing beside the king. Now history itself contradicted them. Charlotte slowly lifted her eyes toward Alexander. He did not look surprised anymore. He simply looked relieved, as though a puzzle he had been assembling for days had finally revealed its image. Yet the greatest revelation was not her ancestry. It was a final statement hidden at the bottom of the recovered registry. When Whitmore read it aloud, even he sounded shaken. According to the document, Charlotte was not merely connected to House Evermont. She was its last living heir. For a long moment after the announcement, the Grand Council chamber remained completely silent. The words seemed too large for anyone to process. Charlotte Bennett, the former servant many had dismissed, was the last living heir of House Evermont. The realization spread slowly through the room, visible in every expression. Some nobles looked stunned. Others appeared deeply uncomfortable. Several avoided looking at Charlotte altogether. She stood motionless beside Alexander, her thoughts racing. She had entered the chamber expecting answers. Instead, she had discovered that an entire chapter of her life had been hidden from her. Professor Whitmore carefully gathered the documents while council members exchanged uneasy whispers. Names that had once carried enormous influence were suddenly being discussed again. House Evermont had not merely been respected. It had once been considered one of the kingdom's most honorable families. Charlotte remembered hearing fragments of old stories as a child. Legends her grandmother would begin before stopping abruptly. At the time, she had never understood why. Now she finally did. Her grandmother had not been protecting a secret. She had been protecting Charlotte. Across the chamber, Duchess Eleanor Whitfield slowly rose from her seat. She was one of the most influential noblewomen in the kingdom and had openly criticized Charlotte's marriage from the beginning. The room quieted as she stepped forward. For weeks, she had treated Charlotte as though she did not belong in royal society. Now she looked almost embarrassed. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, looking directly at Charlotte. "I owe you an apology." The statement surprised everyone, Charlotte included. The Duchess lowered her head. "I judged you without understanding who you were." Charlotte listened carefully. Then she surprised the room with her response. "You did not know." Her voice remained calm. "Neither did I." The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect people more than anger ever could have. One by one, other nobles began acknowledging their mistakes. Some offered formal apologies. Others simply bowed their heads. Charlotte accepted each gesture with quiet grace. She did not seek revenge. She did not demand recognition. She only listened. From his place beside her, Alexander observed every reaction. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Many people would have used this moment to settle old grievances. Charlotte did the opposite. The same kindness she had shown as a servant remained unchanged now that her ancestry had been revealed. That truth mattered more to him than any bloodline. Eventually, the chamber grew quiet again. Alexander stepped forward. His silver eyes swept across the assembled nobles. "There is something I would like everyone here to remember." The room focused entirely on him. He turned toward Charlotte. "The records revealed her lineage today." His voice carried clearly through the hall. "But they did not create her worth." Silence followed. Charlotte earned respect long before any of us understood her history. He paused briefly. "The woman standing here is the same woman she was yesterday." Charlotte felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Alexander continued. "Her character did not come from a family name. Her family name simply confirms what many of us should have recognized sooner." The chamber remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed completely. For the first time since entering palace life, Charlotte was not being measured against her past. She was being seen for who she truly was. And as the session finally drew to a close, she believed the mystery surrounding her identity was over. She had no way of knowing that Professor Whitmore had just discovered one final document waiting inside the archives. A document suggesting that House Evermont's disappearance involved far more than secrecy. It involved a truth that could reshape the kingdom itself. The days that followed felt different throughout the kingdom, not because new laws had been passed, or because power had shifted from one family to another. The change was quieter than that. People began speaking about Charlotte in a new way. Servants who had once worked beside her told stories of her kindness. Palace officials recalled moments when she had helped others without expecting recognition. Even nobles who had doubted her found themselves reevaluating their assumptions. The revelation of her ancestry had captured attention, but the truth of her character left the deeper impression. 1 week after the council session, a formal gathering was held in the Grand Hall to recognize the restoration of House Evermont within the historical records of the kingdom. Banners decorated the chamber. Scholars, nobles, and representatives from every region attended. Yet despite the ceremony's importance, Charlotte felt unexpectedly calm. She stood beside Alexander beneath the vaulted ceiling and looked across the crowd. For the first time since entering royal life, she no longer felt like an outsider. Not because people finally understood her family history, but because she had stopped questioning whether she belonged. Professor Whitmore stepped forward and presented the final findings of the investigation. The lost records had been verified. The family line had been confirmed. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. House Evermont had vanished from public history through years of secrecy and circumstance, but its legacy had survived through a child protected from the attention of the world. As the historian concluded his remarks, applause filled the hall. Charlotte's eyes drifted briefly toward the windows where sunlight streamed across the polished floor. She thought of her grandmother. She wished she could have been there to see this moment. Alexander seemed to sense her thoughts. "She would be proud of you," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled. "I hope so." He looked at her for a moment before speaking again. "There is something everyone here should know." The hall gradually grew silent. Charlotte turned toward him, surprised. Alexander faced the gathering. "Many people have spoken about discoveries made during the past weeks." His voice carried clearly across the chamber. "About names, records, and ancestry." He paused. "But there is one truth that matters more to me than any document." The room listened carefully. Alexander looked directly at Charlotte. "I chose her before I knew any of those things." Emotion softened his expression. Before the letters, before the investigations, before anyone spoke of lost families or forgotten history. Complete silence filled the hall. "I chose her because of her kindness, her integrity, her courage. Those things have never depended on a title." Charlotte felt tears gather in her eyes. Not because of the attention surrounding them, but because she knew he meant every word. The applause that followed seemed warmer than any she had heard before. Genuine. Earned. As the celebration continued, Professor Whitmore quietly returned to the archives. There, resting among the recovered records, remained one final document he had not yet fully examined. Curious, he opened it beneath the glow of a reading lamp. His eyes moved across the faded text. Then he froze. Slowly, he lowered the page and stared into the distance. Hidden within the final record was a statement written decades earlier by a member of House Evermont. It described a future alliance that would shape the kingdom through the union of two bloodlines. And according to the forgotten words preserved across the years, Charlotte's story was never meant to end with the restoration of her family. It was only the beginning of a destiny that had been waiting for her all along.